Good morning, CBC. This flu season, so welcome to what's left of CBC this morning. If you're listening in bed at home with us, we love you too. Excited to be in Philippians again with you this morning, picking up in verse 12, the passage that we just read there. And so to kind of pick up on what we just heard about, we heard about kind of like this missions madness that's coming up in March. And one of my favorite things to do, if I have time to kind of like pick the books that I'm reading, I love reading missionary biographies. I love listening to, hearing accounts from the mission field, hearing what God is doing around the world. I don't think anything for a believer can really rival hearing about how the gospel is moving throughout the world and how God is working to bring people to himself in faith, often in unexpected ways. It's just neat to hear some of the ways that God works to save people and bring them into the kingdom. And so I think what we see in this passage today, in Paul's report to the Philippians, is somewhat of a missionary letter from the field. He's giving some personal updates on his situation, but he's also telling them more than that. He's telling the Philippians what God has been up to in Rome, where he's imprisoned, and how God has really been using his situation for the advancement of the gospel. So before we dive into it, I kind of want to set the stage for us there so that we can feel for just a little bit what maybe the Philippian church would be feeling prior to receiving this letter from Paul. We need to kind of get in to their situation and understand maybe some of the tensions that would have existed there in the church before hearing from him. So imagine with me this, that we were to receive news from one of our missionaries, maybe a missionary who's in a hard-to-reach and very dangerous area that we're supporting, and we were to hear something like Paul's situation, that they had been put in prison for preaching the gospel. So that news comes to us, and then communication is cut off from that missionary that we know and love. And so we're kind of left to wonder what exactly is going on there, worry about details like who, if anyone, is caring for them in this moment, how's their family processing the situation, what's going on. We would want to know many different things. What's going to happen next? This is someone, I'm sure, that's had a super fruitful ministry, so we're happy about the work they've been doing. But now it seems like all of that has been slammed shut in their face. It seems like the door to gospel advancement has been closed in that region. And so they're in jail, we're here. What would the conversations look like or sound like here at CBC if that were to happen? What would people be saying? What groups would we break into? Let me give a few hypotheticals, and you can kind of break down the people you think would fall into these particular groups and how we would respond to it. So first, we would have the worry warriors, right? The people who they worry about any and every situation, and if there's a hypothetical out there, they're going to believe that that's what's happening, right? And so we just kind of send the worry warriors into their own corner, right? Don't infect the rest of us. You guys go worry about all this. And then maybe group number 2 is the prayer warriors. Right, you're going to have a group called to action who's going to pray for these people. They're going to be praying for their release, praying that God would work in the situation to bring them home. Maybe a third related group might be the activists in the church. The ones who are like, we have to do something. We have to advocate for them, right? We need to, start a Facebook post so it'll go viral and we can put some pressure on people and they will release them and we can get these people out of jail and back home. And then I maybe thought of even a fourth group that would exist, and maybe we could call them the interventionist of the church. Right? They're the group that didn't really tell anybody that they were going to meet off to the side, but they start talking about maybe forming a CBC extraction team. Right? They're the go-getters in the church. They're like, let them do all the other stuff. Like, we're going to go get this guy, right? We're going to get them out of trouble. And so, they're like, name their operation something, not like Mission Impossible. It'd be something way cheesier and more Christian, like Mission All Things Are Possible, right? So that's our group. They're ready to go get them. But let's just say that we got the news. We've all been waiting, planning, begging God to intervene, begging God for some news. And then a Skype call comes from that person on the field. And so we're all together, the Skype call comes in. We don't know what to expect, but we quickly answer. We want to see how they're doing, and maybe we assume some things about what we're going to see on the other end when the call comes through. maybe we're going to see that they're like whispering really fast, or they're talking in code and they're trying to give us some details for how we can help them. Or maybe we think they're going to look kind of beat up and downcast and really depressed from this whole situation. We kind of assume the worst is going to happen there. But let's say that the call comes through, and on the other side, looking through the camera, is just the biggest smile you've ever seen. Right? And they just start talking about how wonderful this imprisonment has been. We all look around and go, what's happening here? And they just start talking about how people are coming to faith left and right, and how even some of the people who are responsible for watching them, some of the guards in the prison have come to faith. And then sure enough, like as we're talking to them, these guys that we've never seen before, dressed in uniform, like emerge into the camera and start waving and saying hi to everybody at CBC. We've got like new brothers and sisters, and they're just celebrating what's going on, and then the call ends. Like, how do we process that in the moment? You go, well, that was unexpected, right? That was kind of weird, right? We were not expecting that to take place. But I think what we see happening in Philippians is something very similar is going on. You have these believers in Philippi who have been worried about Paul, worried about him because he's in a Roman prison. He's being persecuted for the preaching of the gospel. They're waiting on a word from him, possibly expecting the worst, but no doubt assuming that since Paul's behind bars, the gospel mission there has been stalled for the time being. It's been shut down. But in our passage, we see that Paul is telling them that far from the gospel stalling out, it's actually through his imprisonment that the gospel is advancing more than ever. All these people are coming to faith, and God is advancing the gospel through adverse circumstances. And so this personal report that we're going to see actually runs through verse 26 of chapter 1, but we're going to handle it in 2 weeks today, split it up. So this week, we'll see Paul explain what has happened to him in prison for the sake of the gospel. Next week, we'll see Paul reflecting a little bit more on maybe what's going to happen to him next in this prison cell. But here's our main idea this morning, is that Paul demonstrates in this passage what it looks like to live for the advancement of the gospel and the glory of Christ, regardless of circumstances. And so we'll make just 2 larger points from this passage. And here's number 1, is that we would live for the advancement of the gospel as well. So after opening with his prayer for the Philippians, Paul moves ahead to give them this personal report. And what he gives them is not a ton of details about what's going on in prison or what life in prison is like. Instead, he gives them a much needed perspective. He says this in verse 12. He says, I want you to know, brothers, I want you to be convinced of this, not to be deceived, right? That what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. All right, so the Philippians know what happened in their midst. When Paul's out of jail, the gospel's advancing. He's an effective tool for the work of the kingdom. But maybe they're assuming that's been put on hold because of his chains. But Paul sets the record straight. Notice what he does not say here. He doesn't say, despite what has happened to me, the gospel is still advancing. What does he say? He said, what has happened to me has really actually served to advance the gospel. Right? It's not that the gospel is advancing despite adversity. It's advancing through the adversity that he's undergoing. And so Paul offers 2 ways that this has happened in his own life. First, Paul has become a prison evangelist in Rome. Look in verse 13. He says, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. So who is the whole imperial guard that Paul is speaking of here? Well, by the end of the first century, or by the first century, this term often referred to the Praetorian Guard. This would have been the elite troops of the emperor himself that would have been stationed in Rome. One commentator notes that there would be about 9,000 of them there in the city. They would have been responsible, though, for guarding Paul on a rotation, and they would have basically been playing man-to-man defense with Paul. They were chained up like one-on-one with him on a rotation, so they would have been there for him, hearing all of his conversations, his prayers, observing every ounce of his life up close. And this rotation of guards allowed Paul access to so many of them that he can say, they all know. It's the whole imperial guard knows that my imprisonment is for Christ, for the gospel. But it's not even limited to that group, we see. He says it has become known not just throughout the whole imperial guard, but to all the rest. Pretty much anyone in Rome who found out that Paul was in prison also heard the reason for his imprisonment, the purpose for it, and that it is for Jesus Christ. Paul is proclaiming this message that Jesus Christ, a man who was executed by Roman crucifixion as an enemy of the state, is now alive, and he is the true Lord. That's what he's proclaiming, and they know it. And Paul apparently enjoyed some evangelistic success as well, and we see that from the end of Philippians in chapter 4, verse 22. This is how he concludes the letter when he says, "Greet every saint in Christ Jesus. The brothers who are with me greet you. All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household." Who's he talking about here? He's talking about those who are connected with the emperor himself. I mean, Paul has made inroads into perhaps the most unreachable place we could think of. He is in Rome for preaching the gospel so that he would stop preaching the gospel, and yet by bringing him there, now he is seeing conversions amongst the imperial guard, even people within Caesar's household himself. And so Caesar may demand people recognize him as Lord, but Paul shows that even those within his camp are bending a knee to the true Lord, Jesus Christ, and they ought to be encouraged by that. The second way Paul's imprisonment has advanced the gospel is by emboldening other believers to preach the word fearlessly. Pick up with me in verse 14. Paul says, "And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." And so the brothers and sisters Paul's speaking of, these are likely believers in Rome, and persecution in Rome was hot during this time. You can imagine how, in such a hostile context, they might have taken a lighter approach to evangelism, or maybe even just backed off of it entirely out of fear of persecution. But it's because of Paul's imprisonment there and his faithfulness to reach these seemingly unreachable people and places that Paul is feeding the courage and boldness of other believers to take up the gospel, to make Christ known with confidence. So Paul is demonstrating the gospel's power, and it's contagious for those around him. I think we see throughout the history of the church that the boldness of believers speaking the gospel under intense pressure and persecution, even in the face of death, is often used by God to fan the flickering resolve of other believers into flame. You think about stories, famous stories like Jim Elliot and his 4 friends who were killed while trying to reach the Auca Indians. And even though these 5 brothers were slain, there are reports that amongst their Wheaton College peers after they died, the amount of those who went to the international mission field afterwards skyrocketed. I mean, we can't even imagine the number of people that went to the mission field because of their story. And so these 5 guys weren't just replaced by 5 other missionaries on the field. They were replaced by a generation of missionaries who went to the field because they laid their lives down for the sake of the gospel. I think it's like the great church father, Tertullian, who said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." What he meant is that persecution, rather than extinguishing the advancement of the gospel, often accelerates the advancement of the gospel. Or, be a little bit more modern, as the great church rapper of our day, KB, put it, said, "We ain't scared of you. What are they going to do? What, murder us? What murder does is send a surge of us to go put churches up." All right, you can go listen to him say it far better than I can. All right. This is what's happening, though, through Paul's affliction. Others are growing in boldness. They're getting off the sidelines. They're speaking the gospel fearlessly. And so what emerges then is that the gospel and its advancement are everything for Paul. It's what we talked about last week. Paul sees his world through gospel-tinted lenses. How can the gospel advance through my circumstances, through my situation? And so there are some bedrock convictions that Paul has that leads him to this. Paul believes and trusts in the sovereignty of God over his life. He believes in the sovereignty of God over the advancement and progress of the gospel. Because of that, Paul doesn't view his circumstances as obstructions to his mission, right? He doesn't see them as stopping what he's supposed to be doing. He views them as divinely ordained opportunities for greater fruit in the mission. That God has placed them in these situations for a reason. That's what it looks like to live with gospel-colored lenses, so to speak. No matter what comes his way, Paul views it as a gift from God and an opportunity to make Christ known. So the question is, what about for us? Do we have that same mentality and understanding of our circumstances, especially adverse ones when they come up in our lives? We could ask the question this way. When tough circumstances come into our lives, and they most certainly will, right? Maybe some of you are walking through them right now, whether that be illness, cancer, tragic loss, persecution for the faith, poverty, other life troubles. We could go down the list, many more. How do we view those circumstances when they come? We give two options. Option number one, see them as obstacles that need to be removed from our life before we can be effective witnesses to the gospel. And so as soon as they come, we go, I wish that I could be about the Lord's work and advancing the gospel, but I just need this removed first, and then I can do that. Or option two, do we see them as opportunities God has granted us to make Christ known through that situation? We see which option Paul goes with, right? He doesn't see prison as an obstacle to gospel advancement. It's an opportunity that God has given him for greater gospel advancement in a place he would have never been able to reach otherwise. How's he going to go reach these guys? He's going to have to be in jail with them. He's going to have to be chained up to them. And so Paul doesn't believe in accidental encounters, but in divine appointments here. And once we have that mentality, we can't fathom, I think, what God can do with our lives. And we really have no clue how God might desire to use our situations for the advancement of the gospel. Just give a few examples, and I'm sure you could tell more stories about it as well. But take, for example, the story that D.A. Carson told about another world-renowned, prominent Bible scholar. This is a scholar who has written extensive works on the New Testament. Was also a missionary, has made the gospel known in countries with little to no gospel witness. But as a child, this future scholar and missionary's parents were not believers. And even though we like to think that this is the way that it happens with all these people, they weren't converted dramatically through hearing great preaching. They didn't read a cutting-edge work defending the Christian faith or go to a crusade. As good as those things can be, that's just not the way it happened. Instead, the family had a neighbor. The neighbor was a simple lady who loved Jesus, but she never headlined like the Gospel Coalition Women's event or anything like that. She was never a renowned speaker, even though those things are very good. Instead, this lady had an incurable disease that she had to live with and suffer from each day. But as the family observed her, they noticed that she never once complained about it. Instead, she rejoiced in it and seemed to have something that just they couldn't understand where she got it from. Right, this joy that transcended her circumstances. And so it was through this lady's perseverance and suffering and her witness to Christ that eventually the mother of this future missionary and scholar came to trust in Jesus, and then her son through her, and the rest is history. Just ask you, do you think that lady during her trial, when the pain is ramping up, when the illness is just taking its toll on her, thought, if I'll just be faithful, the gospel will go worldwide to places that it has never gone before? There's no way she could have known that her life was going to be used in that capacity. But simple faithfulness in the hands of a great God can do wonderful things. And so, be encouraged by that. Two similar examples, I think about two conversion stories of a couple pastors I really admire. I've heard the conversion stories of Matt Chandler and Tony Merida a couple times now. Chandler has had an enormous impact as a pastor in the States, as a speaker, and leading the Acts 29 church planting network. But he shared his story often about how he came to faith through the witness of a football teammate whose locker he was seated next to. The guy was a Christian. Matt was not. And he said the guy was just pretty direct. We often wonder, how do I even start a gospel conversation? Maybe try his friend's tactic. He told Matt, I'm a Christian. I'm going to share the gospel with you. You let me know when you're ready. I was like, all right, and eventually he did. And he came to faith and has been such a big blessing to the church. I mentioned the other guy, Tony, who I've benefited so much from his preaching and writing, but he likewise wasn't a believer. When he went to college, he went to go play shortstop and to pursue a baseball career. But his double play partner, his second baseman, was a believer who also shared the gospel with him. He came to faith, and now I actually learned to preach in part from reading Tony's book on preaching. You think that guy understood what he was doing when he shared the gospel with him, or what God was going to do with it? No way, right? But God can do remarkable things through simple faithfulness to just share the gospel, be a witness in the situations that we find ourselves in. So let that be an encouragement to us all this morning. How can we use our circumstances, bad ones, good ones? How can we use our circles that we're already in for the sake of gospel advancement and encourage others to do the same? Maybe we could think of it like this. I mean, which people kind of, just because of their relationship to you in your life, have to kind of be chained up to you? Right? These guys were like chained to Paul. They had to observe his life and his conversations. I mean, you've got people in your life like that. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's a classmate or a teammate or someone who shares a locker next to you. Maybe it's a family member, someone who's living under the same roof as you. And do we see, again, those situations as obstacles that we have to get around to go do what God's really called us to do? Or do we recognize that God has placed us in those opportunities for a reason to make the gospel known there? And we would just ask God to be faithful in that situation. So use your time with a captive audience. Talk about Jesus. And no matter what, let Paul's life and words remind us that God hasn't made mistakes with our situations. All right, so that's number one. We live for the advancement of the gospel. And then second, verses 15 through 18, we see that we're also to live for Christ's glory rather than our own. In the second half, Paul describes two groups of people that have been emboldened to preach Christ by his imprisonment, though they do so with radically different motives. Let's hear about them, picking up in verse 15. It says, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." So maybe the first group we could call, they're Paul's partners in the gospel. These are the group of people who, out of love for Paul and knowing that he's imprisoned for the defense of the gospel, they preach Christ out of good motives, good will. They're seeking to partner with him and advance the gospel. So they see Paul's in jail. They think, well, we'll take up the responsibility to make Christ known outside the walls, while Paul is doing his job to make Christ known inside the walls. And they are partners with him. Paul's rejoicing for people like that. But then there's the second group. We could maybe call them Paul's competitors in the gospel. Paul says of them in verse 15 that they preach Christ, but they do so from envy and rivalry. These words are going to be big in the next few weeks in Philippians, because this is exactly what Paul calls the Philippian believers not to do. Not to do anything out of envy, rivalry, or selfish ambition. But these envious evangelists, so to speak, are doing just that. In verse 17 it says, "They proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to inflict me in my imprisonment." They're trying to rub salt in the wound for Paul when he's already suffering in jail. It's difficult, though, to know exactly what's driving the actions of these guys, or how their preaching would kind of turn up the heat on Paul in prison. But I think we can say a few things with certainty about them. The first is just this: these are not guys who are preaching a false gospel or a distorted gospel. We think about Paul's words for those who change the message of the gospel in Galatians 1, and he doesn't rejoice in that. Instead, he condemns that. And so for Paul to be rejoicing in their message means that they are preaching a doctrinally sound gospel. So whatever it is they're preaching Christ. And Paul says he can rejoice in the message. It's the motives of the preachers that he questions. And so second about these guys, these competitors are motivated by jealousy of Paul rather than joy in the gospel. Perhaps for whatever reason they've become frustrated with Paul's widespread influence. We see the impact that Paul had in the New Testament, and people got jealous of that. They wanted to have a little bit more of that platform for themselves. They didn't like that this guy who, wasn't just like this physically demanding figure, or this guy that you would just put up front because he has the looks for this part, but he's being used mightily for the work of the gospel. They're frustrated, they're envious, and they have this personal beef with Paul. Either way, though, Paul's imprisonment in their minds has given them an opportunity for Paul's platform to decrease and for theirs to rise up and increase. And they think that this will also hurt Paul as he has to sit in prison and hear about their successful ministry in the world while he's locked up. But these competitors have grossly misunderstood what it is that drives Paul. You think Paul really cares about his platform or his influence, or that his name would be stamped with every advancement of the gospel? Paul's heart is not tethered to those things. Instead, it is tied inseparably to the progress of the gospel. That's all that Paul cares about. And we know that because when he says it in this situation, he means it. He just wants to see Christ proclaimed. It's because Paul says elsewhere in places like Romans 1 that it's the gospel that is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes. It's not his ministry. It's not his influence. It's the gospel message itself. And as long as these guys are unleashing that message, even if they're doing it out of impure motives, Paul's ultimately saying, I can rejoice in that. I can rejoice because the gospel's going out. And we just think about the level of humility that's on display there. How high must Paul esteem Jesus Christ? And how low must he consider himself to hear that these guys are doing this to wound him? As if he needs to be wounded anymore. He's in jail. He's suffering. And yet to hear that and to respond with joy seems borderline insane, but it's right if we, like Paul, have our hearts tied to the progress of the gospel. Paul is living to see Christ glorified, not to see himself honored. I think this brings up a real danger for us, too. We think about this. It's just easy to kind of walk past a passage like this and go, well, I'm not doing that, right? I'm not going and preaching the gospel to try to hurt people who are in jail. But I think it brings up the issue of jealousy and rivalry that still happens so much in the church. It shows us the destructive power of jealousy and pride. I think we probably all know the words of John the Baptist when he sees Jesus and says that he must increase, but I must decrease. And yet, if I were being honest with just the default function of my sinful heart, is often I want to say he must increase, and I would kind of like to increase with him as he does. Right? Maybe you wouldn't say it that way, right? I had the mic. All right, so I'll say it for us. It's like we love the idea of Christ's glory, but if we're not careful, we can also want ours to be tied up with it a little bit and kind of ride his coattails to glory. I have to ask myself this question a lot in ministry. I think serving over the past decade, this is one particular struggle I've had to war against, is that I love the glory of God. I want Christ to be made known. But there are some days that secretly, I have to analyze if there's purity of heart there. Do I want people to just see how magnificent Jesus is, or do I want them to kind of remember who showed them how magnificent Jesus was? It's a dangerous thing to get into. And I think in addition to that, there's nothing nastier than what we see here going on in ministry, nothing more cancerous than when people tear down others or rejoice in hardships others are enduring because of jealousy and the desire to build one's own kingdom. I'm not trying to reveal too much, but I've just heard even in groups of pastors before, conversations can get nasty when you talk about maybe a prominent pastor or someone who's experienced a lot of success, and just the go-to is to talk about all the ways that they're doing it wrong. They're not doing it the way that I would do it, right? They don't really know what they're doing. They have impure motives. And it just becomes a bash fest where we're really tearing them down. Why? So that we can feel like we built ourselves up a little bit. Or even when leaders like those fall from their platform, and rather than grieving, it actually turns into a situation where people are gloating and almost rejoicing over it because it means maybe their kingdom will grow a little bit more. Kent Hughes, in his book, it's been a really helpful book for me, titled Liberating Ministry from the Success Syndrome. He relays an ancient story from the 4th century, and it sounds much like what you'd find in C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, where you have this group of inexperienced demons who are struggling to tempt this very godly man. Frustrated, though, they return to Satan to tell him of their failure. Satan replies that they've had a bad strategy in trying to get this dude to fall. They've been far too harsh with the man. Instead, he tells them to go and to send a different message to the guy this time, and that is to tell him that his brother has just been made Bishop of Antioch. He says, rather than bring him bad news, this time bring him good news. And sure enough, the man hears the news and instantly falls into deep, deep jealousy. Might seem far-fetched, but I think we get the point. I doubt that anyone here at CBC would say, I don't want to see Christ glorified, and I don't want to see him made known in our community. Those things are the gist of our mission statement. We want to see that happen. But what happens if God is primarily using others to do that in far more public and visible ways than us? How do we feel about that when it takes place? What happens when others are praised and recognized and we're not? Is our knee-jerk response to rejoice, or is it to kind of pull back in jealousy? Kind of get a group of people to start telling, yeah, but they're not really doing it the right way, right? We would do it this way, right? It would be more effective if we were in charge of it. They're just getting to do this because they know somebody, or we make all these excuses. All right, they're all just revealing jealousy in the heart there. We need to see what Paul's response is. Even when there's impure motives on the parts of others, he can rejoice if Christ is being proclaimed. As long as Jesus is being glorified, his joy is intact, because Jesus' glory is all he needed, not his own. Is that true for us? We say that Jesus' glory alone satisfies our soul. And so to recap, what does this passage call us to today? And let me give us kind of 3 introspective checks from this passage. The first, it would be just simply to check our status today. And that means is we would check where we stand with Jesus Christ today. We've talked a lot this morning about advancing the gospel in ways akin to Paul here in all circumstances. But before we can advance Christ, the call is first to embrace Christ. And so that would be the question for us before anything else this morning is, do you belong to Christ? Have you turned away from sin to trust in him? We can't live for his glory before we know him in truth. And so we're preparing in a little while to celebrate the truth of the gospel visibly through communion, remembering that for our sake Christ took on flesh and he lived and he died for our sin, and he's now resurrected and reigning, and he will return soon. The call for us is to believe in that message wholeheartedly, turn from sin, trust in Jesus, know him, and make him known. And so have you done that today? Is that your status as one who has responded in faith to Jesus Christ? If so, 2 more checks are in order for us today. The first would be to check your mindset. Whatever circumstances you have in your life, how are you viewing them right now? Are you viewing them as obstacles that you need removed so that you can be about the Lord's work? Or do we have a big enough view of God's sovereignty that we trust whatever situations we have been given by God so that we can make him known in it? Like, how are we viewing those things? Our mindset changes everything about that. God has given us these opportunities all the time. But if we're struggling to figure out where to begin with it, why don't you just ask God to help you find one encounter this week that you can make Christ known in. One person, whether that's a stranger that God opens the door to, someone that you run across in the gym or out in the grocery store or wherever it would be, or maybe someone who is a little bit more consistently chained up with you, like they've got to put up with you. And maybe you haven't been utilizing that situation in a way that you say, I'm intentionally living out the gospel faithfully for them to see the magnificence of Jesus Christ, the worth of Jesus Christ. Ask God to help you do that this week, just with one person. Let that be a start to it. And so, third check would be to check our motives as well. When Christ is proclaimed, when the gospel is advancing, what type of mentality do we have? Do we have a Pauline mentality that says, I rejoice? Or do we have a competitor mentality that says, well, I would have done it this way, or it would have been better, or I don't really believe that's what's going on? What's our knee-jerk reaction, though? Maybe just give us an example today. We want to see Christ made known in the North Shore. Amen? If so, we want to see people come to faith. What if this morning, though, we leave here and let's just say, we didn't have like mass conversions today, like no one came through the door and 100 people came to faith, but we hear a church down the street did. They had 100 people that came to faith, dramatically trusted in Jesus Christ. Is our response, our knee-jerk response, is it to have hearts filled with joy or hearts plagued by jealousy? I wish it would have been us, right? I don't think that that's a very Pauline or Christ-like way to respond if it's jealousy that arises. If we're all in the same game, seeking to advance the gospel by whatever means necessary, we ought to be able to rejoice when Christ is made known. That should be our knee-jerk response. Given how we respond, I think it shows whose glory we care most about. Well, here's the good news for us this morning, if we feel beat up from some of those questions, is there was only one who never had a misplaced motive. There's only one who has never failed to carry out the will of God in every situation. The good news is that Jesus has been faithful where we have been faithless. He has been obedient in every point where we have rebelled against God, and He has taken the penalty for all of our failures upon Himself. It's Jesus who makes this gospel good news, and it's Jesus who is committed to seeing it advance in and through the lives of imperfect people like you and me. And so let's worship Him for it this morning. Would you pray with me? Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you so much for the gospel, and that you do see fit not only to save people like us, but to use us as instruments in your hand to advance the gospel. And Father, I just pray that you would give us a refreshed vision this morning, that as we go back out into our lives later this week, that we would see whatever circumstances are going on, good or bad, devastating or things that are more joyful, that we would see them as given from your hand for our good, for your glory, for the advancement of the gospel. We thank you for the gospel, Father. We ask that as we move into a time of reflection and celebration, that you would draw our hearts and minds to the truth of what you've done through Christ to bring us to yourself, and you would use us to make him known. We ask this all in Christ's name this morning. Amen.